at the tracks themselves, where the controls were tight. The most famous racing venue was Belmont Park, a complex of 5 race courses, a 12,000-seat grandstand and multiple stables, centered around a lavish clubhouse. Middle-class gamblers could frequent the city's race tracks, but the center of middle-class moral gravity was strongly opposed to all forms of gambling. The reform movement was strongest in the 1890s. It was led by men such as the Reverend Charles H. Parkhurst, the leading Presbyterian pastor and president of the New York Society for the Prevention of Crime, Reform Mayor William L. Strong, and his police commissioner Theodore Roosevelt. Reformers passed laws in the state legislature against any emerging gambling venue. Such laws were enforced in most of the small towns and rural areas, but not in New York's larger cities, where political machines controlled the police and the courts. 1920s to 1940, edit. Politics, edit. The Democrats, under the leadership of L. Smith and Robert F. Wagner, embraced reform in the 1910s and 1920s, especially to the benefit of their core constituency, the working class. Smith became governor in the 1920s but lost the 1928 United States presidential election, though he did very well in Catholic strongholds. Smith won New York City. Wagner served in the United States Senate from 1927 to 1949, where he was a leader of the New Deal coalition, paying special emphasis to supporting the labor movement. The 1924 presidential election, in which most New Yorkers voted for Calvin Coolidge, was the last time New York City was carried by a Republican presidential candidate. After 1928, scandal engulfed City Hall. Flamboyant Mayor Jimmy Walker, a Tammany Democrat, resigned and fled to Europe after state investigations showed he had taken bribes. Coupled with the harshness of the Great Depression, this gave an opening to the reformers. They won in 1933 with a fusion ticket headed by Fiorello LaGuardia. He was a liberal Republican congressman with strong Italian and Jewish connections who appealed across party lines. LaGuardia dominated city politics as mayor, 1934 to 1945. He supported President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deal. In turn, Roosevelt heavily funded the city and cut off patronage for LaGuardia's enemies. LaGuardia revitalized New York and restored public faith in City Hall. With the help of Robert Moses, he directed the building of low-cost public housing, public playgrounds, parks, and airports. He reorganized the police force, defeated the still powerful Tammany Hall machine, and re-established the merit system in place of patronage jobs. LaGuardia was a domineering leader who verged on authoritarianism but whose reform politics were carefully tailored to address the sentiments of his diverse constituency. He defeated a corrupt democratic machine, presided during the Depression and World War, made the city the model for New Deal welfare and public works programs, and championed immigrants and ethnic minorities. He succeeded with the support of a sympathetic president who was equally hostile to Tammany Hall. He secured his place in history as a tough-minded reform mayor who helped clean out corruption, bring in gifted experts, and fix upon the city a broad sense of responsibility for its own citizens. His administration engaged new groups that had been kept out of the political system, gave New York its modern infrastructure, and raised expectations of new levels of urban possibility. Ethnics come of age, edit. Immigrant families continued establishing themselves, and more started moving into the neighborhoods outside of Manhattan. In a sign of municipal maturation, the 1920 census showed Brooklyn for the first time overtaking Manhattan as the most populous borough. But the great period of European immigration, which had only just passed its peak, was halted abruptly by the Immigration Act of 1924, which severely limited further immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Harlem Renaissance, edit. Main article, Harlem Renaissance. After 1890, black people started moving into the formerly Jewish neighborhood of Harlem on Manhattan's Upper West Side. Much larger numbers arrived during the era of World War I as the Great Migration brought in blacks to fill more jobs at a time when immigration was suspended. Harlem became the political capital of Black America, with highly controversial leadership from Marcus Garvey in the early 1920s. Sustained civil rights activism took place in the 1930s and 1940s, often led by Baptist minister Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was elected to the United States Congress in 1942. Unemployment was a major problem in the Depression years, but New Deal relief agencies such as the Civilian Conservation Corps and Works Progress Administration provided considerable employment on an equal basis. Much of the organized protest was a demand for jobs and stores owned and operated by whites in Harlem. The Harlem Renaissance from 1920 to 1940 brought worldwide attention to African American literature. For many years, especially in the 1920s, Harlem was home to a flourishing of social thought and culture that took place among numerous black artists, musicians, novelists, poets, and playwrights. The most famous writers included Langston Hughes, James Weldon Johnson, Claude McKay, and Zora Neale Hurston. Jazz Age, edit. The Jazz Age featured celebrities. Among the most notable in the city were Madame Polly Adler, jazz singer Ella Fitzgerald, dancer Martha Graham, speakeasy host Texas Guinan, publisher Henry Luce of Time magazine, writer Dorothy Parker and the pundits at the Algonquin Hotel, editor Harold Ross at the New Yorker magazine, and such nationally famous sports heroes as Babe Ruth and Bill Tilden. Fun-loving Tammany Mayor Jimmy Walker presided over a period of prosperity for the city, with the proliferation of the speakeasy during Prohibition. Tin Pan Alley developed toward Broadway, and the first modern musical, Jerome Kern's Showboat, opened in 1927, as the theater district moved north of 42nd Street. A workman helps raise the Empire State Building 25 floors higher than the Chrysler Building, at Wright, as seen in 1931. During this time, New York City became known for its daring and impressive architecture, including notably the skyscrapers which transformed the skyline. The race to the sky culminated in the dueling spires of two Art Deco icons, the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building, during the late 1920s. These two skyscrapers were not topped off until their soaring heights seemed rather over-optimistic. The construction of the Rockefeller Center also occurred during this time, becoming one of the largest ever private development projects at the time. The city grew outward, too, with residential development replacing most of the farmland of eastern Brooklyn, eastern Bronx, and much of Queens. Great Depression, edit. The Great Depression, which was to affect the rest of the world, began with the stock market crash of 1929. The recently completed Empire State Building would be known as the Empty State Building for many years because it could not attract sufficient tenants in the bleak business climate. When New York Governor Franklin Roosevelt became president, the Hooverville Shacks named after his predecessor dotted city parks. The city became a showcase for New Deal spending, especially through the Public Works Administration and the Works Progress Administration. There were massive building projects including highways, bridges, public housing, new schools, and expansion of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Robert Moses with a model of his proposed Battery Bridge, never built. Parkway planner Robert Moses took charge of building many bridges, parks, public housing units, and parkways with mainly federal money. Moses was a great proponent of automobile-centered modernism whose legacy of massive construction projects is still controversial. He opposed the massive subway expansions proposed in 1929 and 1939. However, the last large expansion of the subway system, combined with the merger of privately owned Interborough Rapid Transit and Brooklyn Manhattan Transit subway companies with the city-owned independent subway system under city ownership, made the subway largely what it is today. In 1938, the city experienced a citywide truckers' strike, most notably hampering port shipping and general foodstuffs. Mayor LaGuardia declared a public emergency near its end, deploying 1,000 sanitation trucks for city supplies. In part due to the city being hit by the 1938 New England hurricane. World War II, edit. Aircraft engine at Naval Training School in the Bronx. New York, long a great American city with many immigrants, became a culturally international city with the brain drain of intellectual, musical, and artistic European refugees that started in the late 1930s. The 1939 New York World's Fair, marking the 150th anniversary of George Washington's inauguration in Federal Hall, was a high point of technological optimism, meant to mark the end of the Depression. After the start of World War II, though, the theme was changed from building the world of tomorrow to for peace and freedom, and the shadow of the war underway in Europe dampened the proceedings. The war transformed New York into a hub of the United States home front during World War II. Over 900,000 New Yorkers served in the war and approximately 63 million tons of supplies and more than 3 million men shipped out from New York Harbor. During the height of the war, a ship left every 15 minutes. Efforts were made to protect New York from attack. During the war, famous landmarks such as Times Square and Broadway were dimmed out to protect New York from an air raid. Posters were put up across all public spaces in New York to instruct civilians on how to respond to an air raid or naval strike. New York was infiltrated by Axis forces during the war. On the evening of the 14th of January, 1942, U-123 entered Lower New York Bay and its crew observed the New York skyline. In his memoirs, the then U-boat captain, Reinhard Hardigan, described the moment he first laid eyes on the New York skyline aboard U-123. "I cannot describe the feeling with words, but it was unbelievably beautiful and great. I would have given away a kingdom for this moment if I had one. We were the first to be here, and for the first time in this war a German soldier looked upon the coast of the USA." While U-boats menaced from without, elements of the Nazi Duquesne spy ring and Operation Pastrius operated within the city. The economy of New York City was boosted by the war effort, but not to the extent of cities with heavy industries such as Pittsburgh, Chicago, Los Angeles or Detroit. The clothing industry produced uniforms, and machine shops focused on war materials. The Sperry Corporation prospered, producing bomb sights and other aviation equipment in Brooklyn. The Brooklyn Navy Yard again increased its production of warships. The large printing industry was scarcely affected. The port facilities again played their role in shipping supplies and soldiers to Europe. The Port of New York handled 25% of the nation's exports. By the war's end, the Navy Yard was the world's largest shipyard with 75,000 workers. When peace arrived in 1945, New York was clearly preeminent in the world, as the only major world city unscathed by the war. Economy, edit. Finance, edit. New York became the financial center of the United States before the Civil War, specializing in railroad securities. By 1900 it grew even more dominant and was starting to approach London as a world financial center. There were thousands of successful bankers and financiers. A central figure was J.P. Morgan, whose House of Morgan set up national financing programs for the steel, agricultural implements, shipping, and other industries. It also financed much of the British and French war efforts in World War I. John D. Rockefeller, of Standard Oil, expanded from a dominant position in oil to other industries as well as banking. Andrew Carnegie dominated steel until he sold out to Morgan in 1901. After 1900, Rockefeller and Carnegie largely devoted their interest to philanthropy, as to a certain extent did Morgan. With the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York became a powerful player under its dynamic president Benjamin Strong. By 1917, New York was funding the World War efforts of Britain, France and 4 other allies. By the 1920s, New York had surpassed London as a world banking center. The New York Stock Exchange was the national focus of wealth making and speculation until its shares suddenly collapsed late in 1929, setting off the worldwide Great Depression. Garment industry, edit. The garment industry involved the manufacture of ready-to-wear clothing for men and women, as well as the wholesaling of these products to stores around the country. New York City dominated the national industry, with Chicago and Los Angeles trailing far behind. It originated in the 19th century rag trade of Jewish tailors, cutters, pressers, peddlers, and shopkeepers. By 1900 it was a largely Jewish-owned and operated industry, and most workers were Jewish, although other new immigrants were being hired. The Yiddish-speaking East European Jews were strong supporters of labor unions, which they related to their socialist influences back in Europe. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGVU, formed in 1900 and was a major player in the American Federation of Labor. It grew rapidly in its first 2 decades and took credit for abolishing sewing work in the tenements, establishing a 6-day, 54-hour week, writing union contracts that gave preference to ILGVU members applying for a job, and setting up arbitration machinery. The union was much larger and stronger than the hundreds of small shops with which it dealt. However, in the 1920s the ILGVU was torn by battles between the established leadership and communists within the party. By 1928 the establishment won out. Communist members of the AFL only remained in positions of power within the furious union. ILGVU membership had dropped to 40,000, the great majority of whom were women. The early years of the Great Depression further undermined the union. Under the leadership of David Jabinsky, the ILGVU became a major supporter of Roosevelt's New Deal, and it grew rapidly in membership in the late 1930s and during World War II. The Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America was a more radical breakaway group that formed in 1914. It focused on ready-made clothing for men, and provided banks, recreation, medical care, and even restaurants and housing for the membership. It expelled its communist members in the 1920s. Under the leadership of Sidney Hillman, it played a central role in forming the Militant Congress of Industrial Organizations in the mid-1930s, and giving Hillman a powerful voice in the New Deal coalition. After 1970, both unions lost membership and merged in 1995. With the Democratic Party in the city largely controlled by the conservative Irish. Jabinsky and Hillman and their unions formed a new political party in 1936, the American Labor Party. It ran a ticket only in New York State, where it enthusiastically endorsed Roosevelt's 3 re-elections. In 1944 a split formed between communist members and the establishment leadership within the party, principally David Jabinsky. David Jabinsky and his allies broke away, creating the Liberal Party of New York. The Liberal Party was led for many years by Alex Rose, the leader of the Hatters Union, a small garment industry union. On the waterfront, edit. NASA image of the Port of New York and New Jersey. The Port of New York and New Jersey was the largest American port by far, serving both passenger and merchant vessels. The port was the main point of embarkation for U.S. troops traveling to Europe during World War I. The congestion at the port led experts to suggest a port authority to supervise the extremely complex system of bridges, highways, subways, and port facilities in the New York-New Jersey area. After the war, the 1919 New York City harbor strike by the Marine Workers Union shut down the port for weeks. It started on January the 9th and paused on the 13th of January for arbitration. The strike resumed March the 4th after workers rejected the War Board labor ruling and ended on the 20th of April, 1919, after new terms had been offered by both public and private port employers. The Port of New York Authority was created in 1921, under the supervision of the governors of New York and New Jersey. By issuing its own bonds, it was financially independent of either state. The bonds were paid off from tolls and fees, and not from taxes. It became one of the major agencies of the New York metropolitan area to handle large-scale projects, especially under the leadership of Austin Tobin. Passenger ships flourished before the coming of transatlantic air carriers in the 1960s. One line of business catered to upscale tourists headed in both directions, with American and British lines in competition. Passenger steamships also carried steerage passengers at low rates. The vast majority were immigrants to the United States, although some immigrants were returning to Europe. Two German companies dominated the immigration traffic to New York from Central and Eastern Europe, the Hamburg America Line and the North German Lloyd. They built elaborate networks of ticket agencies in Europe, offering low-cost one-way packages. Immigrants headed to other cities typically held prepaid tickets paid by their relatives who had already established themselves in the New World. Most new arrivals already had some idea of what they were coming to, from family letters and widely available pamphlet literature. The great majority of travelers from Europe came through New York City, and the immigrants did their paperwork at Ellis Island. A small percentage were rejected because of obvious disease. The steamship companies had to pay their fare back, so they screened for sick passengers ahead of time in Europe. World War I, edit. The city played a major role in publicizing and financing World War I, as well as producing uniforms and warships. There was fear of German sabotage, especially in the aftermath of the Black Tom explosion in 1916. The Bronx, edit. The Grand Concourse and 161st Street at the beginning of the 20th century. The Bronx's history after 1898 falls into several distinct periods. The first is a boom period during 1898-1929, with a population growth by a factor of 6 from 200,000 in 1900 to 1.3 million in 1930. The Great Depression brought a surge of unemployment, especially among the working class, and a slowing of growth. The mid to late century were hard times, as the Bronx declined in the 1950s through the 70s from a predominantly moderate income to a predominantly lower income area with high rates of violent crime and poverty. An economic and developmental resurgence began in the late 1980s and continued through the 1990s. Politics in the borough from 1922 to 1953 was under the tight control of the Democratic Organization, with Edward J. Flynn at the helm. Generally referred to as the boss, he ran the political machine like a business executive, paying particular attention to choosing top lieutenants, and providing services to grateful voters. In sharp contrast to the leaders of Tammany, he cooperated very smoothly with Franklin Roosevelt both as governor and as president. See also, edit. 1 American Urban History. 2 Timeline of New York City. 3 1917 New York City mayoral election. 4 1921 New York City mayoral election. 5 1925 New York City mayoral election. 6 1929 New York City mayoral election. 7 1933 New York City mayoral election. 8 1937 New York City mayoral election. 9 1941 New York City mayoral election. 10 1945 New York City mayoral election. References.
Good. That was a good long one, but it's 10 p.m. in a few minutes. We need to stop reading today. So I will save this one. Like there are a lot of good links. So we need to continue reading tomorrow. Now I open a lot. So what do I have open? City of Great American Dream. Yes, I'm sitting in my underwear, so just keep my camcorder there. Need to find the next History of New York 46. So now I open so many news. Stock market, political, so So we have to read all kind of random soon just to close it down because I have so much open. Titanic. So that will take many months to read this, many weeks or months. All this I did open just now. So this is next one. And next. So let's read this tomorrow. I have too much open. It's 10 p.m. I'm sitting in my underwear, so I have to go to bed and upload this. So I need to stop today because it's 10 p.m. So I will go to my bed. Then I will continue reading tomorrow.